Entry 847,203. Keeper Oravan Saul, Senior Archivist, Accord Centrum Thal. Time of interruption, 06:14, Accord Standard. I note for the record that I was running, which I have not done in 40 years, and that the scrolls under my forearms were falling, one by one, onto the corridor floor, and that I did not stop to pick them up, which I have also not done in 40 years. Some mornings announce themselves before they arrive. The alarm had been sounding for 11 minutes by the time I reached the convocation floor. I know it was 11 minutes because I noted the timestamp when the alarm first sounded, because I am an archivist and noting timestamps is what I do even when my legs are shaking, and the scrolls are going, and the corridor seems longer than it has ever been in 230 years of walking it. The Vorrhal envoy was already speaking when I arrived. He was announcing a fleet, 400 ships of primary class designation, he said, already past the outer boundary markers, already aimed at a world whose file I had personally sealed 2 centuries ago. I stopped in the doorway. 400 ships, primary classification, already moving. The cold weight that had been sitting quietly in my chest for 200 years settled deeper. The Vorrhal envoy was still talking. His voice carried the particular quality of a being who has given this speech before and knows how it ends. He did not look up when I came in. He did not look up because he was addressing the Accord, and I was an archivist, and archivists do not require acknowledgement. He had no idea what he had just done. Stay with me. What they built in 200 years of quiet, that part comes next. The stamp had been in my inner case for 230 years. Not the same inner case. I have gone through 7 of them over the decades, the stitching giving out, the fabric wearing thin at the corners, but the stamp itself has never changed hands. Flat matte composite, finger width grip. The word quarantine embossed on its underside in 3 Accord scripts, the letters worn but legible, the grip worn smooth on the right side where my primary thumb rests. I had transferred it from case to case the way you carry a thing that you are not sure how to put down. There had been mornings when I took it out, set it on the desk, looked at it, put it back. I had never once, in 230 years, decided what to do with it. That is where the story begins. Not on the convocation floor, not with the alarm, not with the Vorrhal envoy and his 400 ships. It begins on a morning that looked like every other morning sub-level 9 of the Accord Centrum Thal, the long corridor of sealed archive cabinets, the faint smell of preservation fluid that had been part of my breathing for so long I only noticed it when it was absent. It begins with me at my desk at 05:40, 34 minutes before the alarm sounded, entering routine session notes from the previous day's trade arbitration proceeding. I am, if the record requires a precise description, unremarkable. Not in my work. The work is precise, which is its own form of distinction, but in the way that a 230-year career in archival records administration is unremarkable. I have sat at the back of every important session held in the Accord Centrum Thal since the 38th Council cycle. I have transcribed the words of fleet commanders and heads of state and first contact envoys and peace arbiters who shaped the galaxy's last 3 centuries. I have kept those records with complete accuracy and no personal comment, because personal comment is not part of the job, and I have always understood the job. I have been summoned in an emergency exactly once. This morning, the convocation floor is not a comfortable room. It was designed to be important rather than comfortable, and in 4,000 years it has achieved exactly that. The floor material is frictionless white composite, a substance with the unusual property of amplifying footsteps, not loudly but precisely, so that every entry is heard by every occupant, so that the sound of arrival is a kind of announcement. The walls are carved from asteroid rock and lined with treaty stone tablets, the record of every binding agreement the Accord has made across 4 millennia. The chamber has a zero-gravity assist at its center that makes even small beings feel level with the tallest, a feature that was revolutionary when the room was built and is now simply part of what the room is. It is a space designed to make everyone equally uncomfortable. I registered this the way I always register it, as a note, a detail to be filed, and then I registered the room itself. The Felnari ambassador, Korath Selm, stood at his designated position with his silver fur flattened entirely against his shoulders. Not the partial flatten of professional discomfort, the full flatten of a being whose body has stopped pretending. 3 decades of careful diplomatic composure, and his body had simply given up and told the truth. I have transcribed 47 of his formal addresses. I have never seen his fur flat. The Ethari speaker, Ethari, do not use names in formal settings, only light pattern signatures, had dimmed to a slow pulse that I recognized from the records as the light pattern of concentrated dread. The Ethari are the oldest continuous member of the Accord. They do not dread casually. The water-form delegates from the Tessin Gulf were pressing their bodies against the forward membrane of their transit containers, which the transit containers were not designed to accommodate, and which was producing an audible strain in the membrane seals that no one had yet addressed, because everyone in the room had other concerns. And at the geometric center of the floor, standing precisely where he had no right to stand without invitation, the Vorrhal envoy. His name was Thrak Ossel, voice of the Vorrhal Dominion, and he was 3 meters of layered black-gold chitin armor with jawplates capable of producing subsonic resonance that smaller species felt in their chest cavities. He had a long-healed scar running across his left forward eye from a campaign he considered decorative. He carried no weapon openly, because the Dominion considered visible weapons a sign of insecurity. He stood in the geometric center of the floor because that is what Vorrhal do when they enter a room. They locate the center and occupy it, not as a conscious choice, but as an instinct so deeply embedded they do not notice they are doing it. A territorial claim so automatic they had stopped seeing it. He was mid-sentence when I came through the door. He did not pause. That was when my scrolls went. I should explain about the scrolls. I had been carrying them because I had been in the middle of a records transfer when the alarm sounded, and I had gathered what I could and run, which meant I had approximately 14 archival documents pressed against 4 arms that were not designed to carry 14 archival documents at a running pace. The first one went on the outer corridor. The second went at the junction. By the time I reached the convocation floor, I had 6 remaining, and then the door opened and the floor's composite surface was right there, and all 6 went at once. The amplifying tiles made each one sound like a small declaration. Thrak Ossel stopped mid-sentence and turned. Among the Vorrhal, the response to an unexpected sound is a territorial assessment. They locate the source, determine the threat level, and classify. Ossel located me, determined the threat level, and then he laughed. It was the laugh of a being who has faced 6 civilizations across a table and watched them fold, and who has now encountered an archivist on a corridor floor surrounded by falling documents, and who has found this appropriate to the occasion. My left hands went still. I have a stresstel. My colleagues know it. When I am overwhelmed, my 2 left hands stop coordinating. They go still while my 2 right hands continue working. I do not notice when it happens. I only know it happened when someone tells me afterward, or when I review the session record and see the gap in my typing. My left hands went still, and I stood in the doorway, and Ossel was still laughing, and Korath Seln's silver fur was completely flat, and the Ethari speaker pulsed a frequency I recognized from the records as the Ethari equivalent of a wince. I reached into my inner case without thinking about it. The stamp was there. It is always there. My primary thumb found the worn smooth grip the way it always does, and I stood in the doorway of the convocation floor with my left hand still, and my thumb against the stamp's grip and 6 archival documents on the floor, and I looked at Thrak Ossel, and I thought, you have no idea whose file that is. Then I stepped onto the floor. My footsteps were very loud. I need to tell you what a Class 9 quarantine seal is, because what happened next requires it. The Accord has 9 levels of quarantine classification. Level 1 through Level 5 are administrative. They are applied to worlds with hazardous atmospheric conditions, or active geological instability, or civilizations in early developmental periods that require non-contact protocols. Level 6 through Level 8 are applied to situations that require active monitoring, worlds with detected weapons programs, or unstable governments, or resources requiring controlled extraction. These seals have been applied, in various combinations, 1,400 times across the Accord's history. A Level 9 seal has been applied 4 times. It is the highest classification the Accord has ever issued. It requires a quorum vote, a senior archivist's counterstamp, and the personal authorization of the speaker on duty. 3 of the previous Level 9 seals were applied to worlds later confirmed as catastrophic hazards. 1 caused the Pelvian corridor collapse. 1 produced the Mir cascade. 1 is still classified at a level I am not authorized to access. The 4th Level 9 seal is the one I stamped on Solen's file 200 years ago, on a morning when I was a junior archivist and thought I understood what I was doing. I reached the center of the floor. My footsteps stopped. The silence after them was very large. A Class 9 quarantine seal, I said, is not applied to small things. Thrak Ossel's jawplates shifted. Not the agitation click, not yet, but a realignment, a minor recalculation. The survey team that came back from Solen did not come back with data on atmospheric hazards or geological instability, I said. They came back frightened. They sat in front of a quorum of Accord delegates and they said, "We do not know what to do with this, and we think the Accord does not know either." They asked the Accord to look away. The Accord agreed. I was the archivist on duty. I stamped the order. I used my own hand. I could feel the stamp against my left primary thumb. My left hands were still. That seal was not placed on Solen because its inhabitants were weak, I said. It was placed because the Accord did not know how to be in the same room as what Solen was becoming. The chamber was quiet. Ossel looked at me for a long moment. Then his jawplates settled back into their default configuration, and he smiled, a Vorrhal smile, which involves the jawplates spreading in a way that exposes the inner resonance chambers and suggests a level of amusement that is also a threat assessment passed. He said that the Accord's discomfort with certain civilizations was not his concern. He said the Vorrhal Dominion had studied Solen's signal profile and found no evidence of weapon systems meeting primary class resistance thresholds. He said the world had no engines registering above tertiary classification. He said it had been quiet for 200 years, which was, in his experience, how quiet things stayed. He said this with the ease of a being who has given this speech 6 times and watched the room agree with him each time. He said it the way you say a thing when you know the script. He had no idea the script was about to end. It was young Pell Uvrath who noticed the speaker moving. Pell is my records aide. He had been with me for 3 years, which is nothing on my scale and everything on his. And he had the quality that good aides have of being present without requiring acknowledgement. He was standing at the back of the chamber with a stylus and a noting tablet, doing his job, watching everything with the wide, careful attention of someone who does not yet know which things will matter. He caught my eye and indicated, quietly, the small gesture archivists use, that the speaker was activating a console. I looked. The Athari speaker had moved to the chamber's secondary archive interface, the old one, the one built into the treaty stone wall that most current Accord staff did not know was still operational. He was entering an access sequence that I recognized that I had written 200 years ago as part of the quarantine file's supplementary protocols. My throat sac compressed. The display above the convocation floor activated. "The Accord," the speaker said, in the measured cadence of very old beings delivering information they have waited a long time to deliver, established a long-range monitoring station at Peridian Relay Point 7 following the quarantine seal. The station was designated passive observation. It has been running continuously for 200 years. Ossel's jawplates clicked once, and the archive, the speaker said, is available. He pressed the final key. I did not know the Peridian Watcher was still running. I had established it. I had written the protocol. I had signed the authorization. And in 200 years of keeping Solen's file, I had not once thought to check whether the Watcher was still operational, because checking would have required opening the file, and opening the file had always felt, in a way I never documented because it did not belong in a professional record, like pressing on a bruise. The display began to play. The Peridian Station's archive covers 200 years of passive observation at 17-second capture intervals. Played at standard display speed, it would take decades to review. The speaker had set it to a compression that showed each year in approximately 4 seconds, a time-lapse of 2 centuries, running on the convocation floor's main display. While Thrak Ossel watched and I watched in Koreth Selm's silver fur, impossibly, flattened further. In the first decades, Solen looked the way our original survey described it. Cities, agriculture, early orbital infrastructure, the kind of thing that develops naturally in a civilization approaching its first space age. Nothing alarming, nothing that would explain why the survey team had come back frightened. Then somewhere around the 40-year mark, the night side changed. It was gradual at first, points of light that could have been cities. Then a pattern to the points, too regular to be organic, too precise to be unplanned. By the 60-year mark, the pattern had become a grid, and the grid was growing, and what had begun as isolated points had connected into something that covered the night side of the planet the way circuitry covers a board. By the 80-year mark, the grid extended to the moon. By the 100-year mark, there were structures on the dark side of the moon that our archive had no classification for. By year 150, there were shapes in orbit that I could not name. Ossel's jawplates had begun their agitation click at around the 90-year mark. By year 160 of the archive, the clicking had stopped. He was very still. "What is it building?" he said. He said it quietly. The chamber heard it anyway, because the amplifying tiles hear everything. I had the answer my file contained, which was no answer at all. I had the answer the archive was showing us, which was also not an answer but was at least a shape, the outline of a thing without the name of it. I had the weight of the stamp in my inner case, and 200 years of choosing not to open the file and the memory of the survey team's faces, which I had transcribed but never forgotten. "Everything," I said. "It has been building everything." The archive reached its final frame, the most recent capture, 17 seconds before the Vorrhal fleet's announcement this morning, and the display held. Solen at 06:13 Accord Standard. The night side blazing, the orbital structures fully deployed, though what deployed meant for shapes without classification, I could not say. The grid on the planet's surface not merely operational, but this was the word the file gave me and I cannot improve on it, breathing, pulsing at intervals that had a rhythm to them. A designed rhythm. The moon's dark side installations oriented, as they had not been in any previous frame, toward the outer system. Toward where the Vorrhal fleet had been for the last 11 minutes. Ossel stepped back from the display. I noted this in my session log. In 20 years of observing Vorrhal diplomatic conduct, I had never written those words. The Vorrhal do not step back. Stepping back is, in their behavioral vocabulary, a significance that they reserve for situations that require a fundamental reassessment of standing. Ossel stepped back from the display, and his jawplates were still, and for the first time since he had entered the convocation floor and stood in its geometric center without invitation, he was not standing in the geometric center. He had moved 2 steps toward the outer ring. He had not noticed he had done it. Above us, on the display, Solen's grid pulsed once, twice. The orbital shapes completed whatever configuration they had been moving toward. Koreth Selm made a sound that did not translate. Pel Uvrath, at the back of the chamber, had stopped writing. I could feel the stamp against my primary thumb. My left hands were still. The live feed from the Vorrhal fleet's approach corridor opened on the secondary display. Ossel had left it running when he entered the chamber, because in his experience, running the approach feed during a speech to the Accord was a demonstration of inevitability, a way of saying, "This is happening regardless of what you say in this room." The fleet was crossing into Solen's orbital approach. 400 ships, primary classification, in 3-wave formation, forward strike, flanking second, command protective third, moving in the wide wedge that the Vorrhal use for atmospheric entry intimidation, because it is the formation that looks most like something that cannot be stopped. The grid on Solen's surface pulsed again, every frequency simultaneously. The chamber's receivers caught it before the translation engines had time to process it. A signal that was not one signal but hundreds, broadcast from every point on the planet's surface, from every orbital station, from every dark side installation the Watcher had spent 200 years recording, all of them saying the same thing, all of them saying it at once, in a range of languages that our translation engines processed in under a second and displayed on the chamber screen in a chord standard. One word. No. Thrak Ossel's jaw plates fired. The subsonic resonance hit the chamber before anyone had time to brace for it. A low, involuntary discharge, the Vorrhal equivalent of a startle response, and it moved through the room the way a wave moves through water, and I felt it in my chest. And Korath Seln took one step backward, and three of the smaller aides at the chamber's edge moved back without meaning to, and the Ethari speaker's glow flickered once and then steadied. Ossel pulled his jaw plates back to neutral. He straightened. He looked at the display, the single word still hanging there in a chord standard, and his voice, when it came, was very controlled. "A word is not a fleet," he said. He was not wrong. But above us, the orbital shapes were moving. The envoy had stopped laughing. I noted this in my session log at 06:31 a chord standard, because in 230 years of keeping records I had never written those words, and things that have never been written deserve a timestamp. Thrak Ossel, voice of the Vorrhal Dominion, who had laughed when my scrolls fell, and who had spoken his fleet's arrival the way you speak a thing you already know the ending of, he was not laughing. He was watching the display. The orbital shapes above Solen were still moving, configuring into something our classification systems had no entry for, and the word no was still on the secondary screen in a chord standard, and the fleet's approach feed was still running, and Ossel was watching all of it with the jaw plates of a being whose script has just encountered a line it did not contain. I picked up my noting pen. I had nothing to write yet. I put it back down. The first wave crossed the threshold at 06:33. 400 meters of Vorrhal primary-class vessel, the forward strike formation's lead ship, moving at standard approach velocity into the orbital corridor above Solen. On the approach feed, it looked the way it always looks: massive, deliberate, carrying the particular authority of a thing that has crossed this kind of line before and found nothing waiting. The Solen primary system activated. I cannot tell you what it looked like precisely, because the Watcher's recording crystals struggled to hold the data, and what reached the chamber display was an approximation rather than a record. What I can tell you is what it did not look like. There was no flash. There was no debris field, no expanding cloud of hull material and atmosphere and the remnants of whatever had been inside. There was no heat signature. There was no sound, because space does not carry sound, but there was also no light, no radiation bloom, none of the markers our instruments used to record the end of a large object. The ship ceased to occupy space. One frame it was there. The next frame, the space it had been in, was empty, and the stars behind it were unobscured, and there was nothing to indicate that anything had ever been in that specific volume of the orbital corridor, except that, 17 seconds earlier, something had been. The chamber was completely silent. The second ship crossed the threshold. It ceased to occupy space. The third. The fourth. I was writing in my session log. I was writing because I am an archivist and this was happening and someone had to put words to it, and the words I was writing were inadequate and I wrote them anyway. I wrote, first wave vessels entering approach corridor. I wrote, primary Solen system activating. I wrote, vessels, and here my pen stopped, because the word I needed did not exist in any Accord classification system I had access to, and I sat with the pen on the page for a moment before I wrote the only honest word I had. Gone. Thrak Ossel made a sound. I have transcribed sounds from 47 species across 230 years of Accord sessions. I have a reference archive of 6,200 cataloged vocalizations with species attribution and emotional register annotation. The sound Thrak Ossel made at 06:34 Accord standard is not in that archive. I checked afterward. I checked 3 times. It is not a sound his species makes during combat, during defeat, during grief, during any of the classified registers that Vorrhal vocal anatomy is capable of producing in normal operating conditions. It is a sound that requires a situation that has never existed before, which is the situation of a being encountering something for which his entire civilization has no category. I added it to the file under its own entry. I did not know what to call it. I left the classification field blank. The second wave flanked. I want to be precise about this, because the precision is important. The Vorrhal second wave flanking maneuver is one of the most practiced formations in their fleet doctrine, refined across 6 absorption campaigns, designed specifically to catch a defensive force that has committed its attention to the first wave approach. It works because it requires the defending force to choose, face the direct threat or face the flanking move, and accept the cost of whichever one you do not face. Solène was waiting for the flanking move. The additional units rose from the outer quadrants of Solène's orbital architecture, from positions the Watcher had recorded as inactive for the past 6 months, from positions that had looked, on the archive feed, like structural elements of the grid rather than operational systems. They rose and turned, and the flanking wave encountered them before the second ship had completed its entry into the approach corridor. The flanking wave ceased to occupy space. The third wave attempted retreat. Solène was waiting for that too. Units rose from behind the retreating formation, from positions further out, positions that must have been placed weeks ago, before the Dominion's fleet had even crossed the Accord boundary markers. Before the announcement, before Ossel had stood in the convocation floor and told the Accord that 400 ships were already moving, Solène had been waiting before they arrived. A wide, soft net. That was how it looked on the display, not a cage, not a wall, but a net with gaps in it, and the gaps were clearly not accidental, and what the gaps meant was, you can remain in formation and be destroyed, or you can move into the gaps and be controlled, and we are comfortable with either. The fleet chose the gaps. The fleet was now, in the most precise military sense, surrounded. The fleet master's feed activated on the tertiary display. He sat down. I have to be precise about this too. Among the Vorrhal, sitting during engagement is not a tactical choice. It is not a pause, not a recalibration. In their military vocabulary, which I have in the archive, because the Accord keeps records of everything, even the things it hopes never to need, sitting during active engagement, is the physical declaration that the engagement is over. It means, I have assessed the situation and concluded that whatever I do next, I will not do it as a combatant, because I am no longer in a position from which combat has meaning. The fleet master sat down. He put one hand across his face. He did not give another order. Stand down, he said to the feed to the fleet. All ships, stand down. The chamber heard it. The amplifying tiles catch everything that comes through the room's receivers, and the fleet master's voice came through the receivers, and the tiles caught it, and it sat in the room with us for a moment before anyone moved. Ossel turned to the Ethari speaker. Stop them, he said. The ceremonial register was gone from his voice. He was speaking in a register I did not have a formal classification for, but which I recognized from my own chest, the voice of a being who has run out of script. Tell them to stop. Tell them it was a mistake. The speaker regarded him with the patience of a very old being who has waited a long time for this specific moment. The Accord, the speaker said, has not spoken to Solène in 200 years. We have no open channel. Ossel's jaw plates were still. Open one. The first contact with Solène this morning, the speaker said, was made by the Vorrhal Dominion. The form of that contact was the fleet's approach and your announcement of intent. That was the first communication between a known civilization and Solène in 2 centuries. The Accord did not make that choice. You did. The jaw plates did not move. There is no channel to open, the speaker said. We will wait. Pel-Uvrath found me at 0647. He came through the outer ring of the chamber quietly, in the way that good aides move when the room is full of something they do not want to disturb. He had his noting tablet, and on the tablet he had the Peridian Archive's timestamp data, the passive monitoring log, the record of what the Watcher had captured over 200 years. And he was looking at it with an expression I had not seen on his face before, which was the expression of someone who has found something in a document that changes the meaning of all the other documents around it. He showed it to me without speaking. The Watcher's passive log tracks more than visual data. It also records radio frequency activity in the station's range, an automatic function, a background process. The kind of thing that runs without anyone asking it to and fills up storage that no one checks. Over 200 years, the Peridian station had logged 847 distinct accord frequency broadcasts that fell within its reception range. All 847 showed the same anomaly in their return echo analysis. They had been received, decoded, the mathematical signature of a return echo from a signal that has been processed, not reflected, not absorbed but processed, engaged with, answered internally, is different from background noise. It is different in a way that takes a very specific kind of analysis to detect, and Pell had been doing that analysis because he had been looking at the timestamp data and noticed something that did not fit the expected pattern, and he had run the check, and he had found what he found. Solène had been listening to accord communication for 212 years. Not occasionally, not selectively, every open session, every frequency, the trade arbitrations, the border negotiations, the member state councils, the session 40 years ago where the Accord had debated whether to revisit the Solène quarantine file and decided by a narrow vote to leave it sealed. That session, Solène had heard that one too. I set the tablet down. I reached for my pen, realized I still had nothing to write, set it down. They knew our names, didn't they? Pell said. It was not quite a question. He was looking at the blank display where the word no had been, and his voice had the quality of someone who has just understood the true size of something by finding its edge. I looked at him. He was 26 years old, young, in any species reckoning, and he had spent 3 years learning to be invisible in important rooms, and he had just found something that had been invisible in the most important room for 212 years. I did not answer immediately. In 230 years of professional life, I have been asked questions I could not answer because the records were incomplete, or classified, or lost. I have never been asked a question I could not answer because the answer was too large for the space the question had made for it. They knew everything, I said. He nodded slowly. He picked up his stylus. He did not write anything either. Above the chamber, the fleet waited in its net. The grid on Solène's night side pulsed at its designed rhythm. In my inner case, the stamp pressed against my left primary hand. The hand was still. The new signal came at 0702. It did not sound like a weapon. It did not carry the bandwidth signature of a targeting system, or the frequency spread of a jamming array, or any of the electromagnetic profiles that the Accord's receiver systems flag as threat adjacent. It came through every channel simultaneously, the way the single word had come, but this time it was not one word. It was a voice, a human voice, a woman's voice, measured and unhurried, carrying the particular quality of calm that belongs only to beings who have already decided what they are going to say and are simply waiting for the room to be ready to hear it. She addressed the Accord chamber first. She used the correct honorific for every species present. The Felnari short formal, which requires 3 years of study for most non-Felnari diplomats, and which Koreth Seln had once told me, in a session aside I recorded but did not distribute, he was moved by when outsiders made the effort. She used it correctly. She used the Ethari light glyph transliteration, which requires understanding not merely the phonetic system, but the underlying principle that the Ethari do not perceive titles the way other species perceive them, that a title, for the Ethari, is not a label but a relational descriptor, and must be spoken with that understanding present in the speaking. She used it correctly. She used the Tessin water form address pattern, which is technically not a spoken form at all but a pressure modulation, and she had adapted it, imperfectly but recognizably, into audio frequency, and the Tessin delegates at the front of their transit container went very still. Koreth Seln's silver fur lifted. Not entirely, but the shoulder fur, the top layer, rose slightly from its flattened position, the way fur rises when a being has been cold for a long time and something warm has entered the room. She addressed Thrak Ossel by his full ceremonial lineage title. It takes 12 seconds to say correctly. The lineage title is not used outside the Dominion. It is not in any Accord-accessible record. It is the title that Ossel had not been addressed by since his elevation ceremony 40 years ago, spoken in the chamber of the Dominion's home world by his family and his superior commanders, in a moment that was private by definition, and had never, in any form, been transmitted beyond the Dominion's internal communications. She said it correctly. Ossel's jawplate stopped clicking. She addressed the fleet master by his name, his rank, and the campaign designator of his third absorption operation, not the number used in Dominion public records, but the internal designator, the one used only within the fleet command structure, the one that appears in no document the Accord has ever accessed. Helen lifted the ceramic cup she had been holding. She sipped. She set it down. She folded her hands. Then she spoke for 4 minutes. I have the transcript. I will not summarize it here. A summary would be an insult to the precision of it. She told the fleet master his soldiers would be received. She told him they would be fed and rested and returned when the Dominion came to the table, not if, when. She said the word table in 3 languages. Accord Standard, Vorrhal Primary, and a third language I did not recognize that I later learned was an old Vorrhal trade dialect used only in the southern expansion corridors. The dialect the fleet master had grown up speaking before his recruitment into the command corps. The dialect his grandmother had spoken. The dialect that does not have a word for enemy, only for stranger not yet known. She had done her reading. She spoke about restraint, not abstractly, not as a principle, but as a choice that had been made on specific mornings by specific people across 200 years. She said, we knew what was coming. She said, we decided how to be ready. She said, we also decided what kind of ready we wanted to be. She said this in Accord Standard, and then repeated the last sentence in Vorrhal Primary, and then was quiet for 3 seconds. And the quiet was deliberate, and everyone in the room felt that the quiet was deliberate. Then she said the thing that stopped the chamber. Calm, unhurried, without preamble, as if it were the obvious conclusion to everything that had just happened, as if the 4 minutes before it had been preparation for a sentence this simple. Solène wishes to apply for membership in the Galactic Accord. The Athari speaker's glow went white. Not the pale pulse of dread, not the slow dim of concentration. White, full spectrum, the light pattern that the Athari use for one thing and one thing only, which I have seen once in 230 years, which is the pattern of a being that has just witnessed something it will spend the rest of its long life trying to adequately describe. Korath Seln sat down. He sat down during a standing session. In recorded Accord history, across 4,000 years of formal proceedings on the convocation floor, no Felnari ambassador has ever sat during a standing session. The Felnari do not sit when standing is required. Their formal code is explicit on this. Korath Seln, who had spent 30 years following that code with the precision of a being who believes in what it represents, sat down. At the back of the chamber, Pel Uvreth dropped his stylus. It hit the amplifying tiles. In a room that had just heard a civilization announce itself after 200 years of silence, a stylus falling on composite tiles should not have been audible. It was. The tiles catch everything. The sound of the stylus was very small and very loud, and several heads turned toward the back of the room, and Pel looked at the floor where his stylus had gone, and then he looked at me, and his expression was the one I had been looking for in my records archive for 230 years. The expression of someone who has just understood that they are alive at the exact moment when the shape of things changes. Thrak Ossel, kneeling on the convocation floor with his armored hands folded in his lap, his jawplate still, his scar catching the chamber light, made no sound at all. I stood in the center of the floor. The stamp was pressing against my left primary hand, the hand that had been still since I came through the door, the hand that had not coordinated with the right hands all morning. It was pressing against my left primary hand, and my left primary hand was, for the first time in this long morning, the steadiest part of me. We sealed them away because we did not know what to do with them. They spent 200 years becoming something we still do not have a word for. I was very glad I had kept the scrolls. Pel looked up from the floor where his stylus had fallen, and he said quietly, not quite to me and not quite to the room, she knew my name too. I looked at him. He was right. In Helen Ashvar's address, she had used every name in the chamber. She had used mine. She had used Pell's, his full name, the formal version that appears in Accord staff records and that Pell himself rarely uses because he finds it formal to the point of being slightly embarrassing. She had used it correctly, with the right stress pattern for his species naming conventions. I did not answer him immediately. The question of what else Solène knew, what else they had learned in 212 years of careful listening, what else the archive contained that we had not thought to check, opened in the room and did not close. The chamber did not empty for 7 minutes after the transmission ended. 7 minutes of stillness, of 6 species breathing in the same room, of the amplifying tiles recording the sound of it, which I noted in my session log because in 230 years of record keeping, I had never logged breathing as a significant event. This was the first time it was. The speaker rose at minute 8 and addressed Solène formally, through every open channel because that was all there was to do. Solène confirmed the application. They asked only that the accord take its time. They had been patient for 2 centuries. They could be patient a little longer. The accord had not admitted a new member in 310 years. That evening, working alone in the archive sublevel after the chamber had finally emptied, I discovered that there was no standard form for a membership acknowledgement. In 310 years, no one had needed one. I had to draft the form from scratch, from the original principles, from the documents in the cabinet at the back of sublevel 9 that no one had opened in 3 centuries. It took until morning. I did not mind. Ossel left without speaking. The speaker gave him a formal instruction to carry the day's record to the Dominion's leadership with accuracy, and Ossel took it, and he left, and the sound of his footsteps on the amplifying tiles was the sound of a script that had ended without its expected final scene. 18 months. Helen Ashvar arrived 4 months after the chamber session, leading Solène's formal delegation. She was older than I had expected, white-haired, unhurried, carrying a small ceramic cup of warm drink, the way someone carries a thing that has been with them long enough to become part of how they move through rooms. She made courtesy in every language with the ease of someone for whom courtesy was not performance but posture, the natural shape of how she stood. She was accompanied by a quiet old soldier named Reneth Cole, who never spoke during formal sessions but stood at the back of every room and watched everything with the attention of someone who has spent a long career keeping track of what happens in the spaces between what people say. Voss Rendal arrived 6 weeks later, representing the Dominion at the negotiating table. He came with his head down. He was not Ossel. He sat where he was directed to sit, and he said what he had been sent to say, and he did not stand in any room's geometric center. The fleet master, thinner than he had looked on the feed, calmer in the way that some hard experiences leave people calm, came to the centrum as part of the Dominion's formal engagement process. He shook Helen Ashvar's hand. He did not let go for a long time. Helen said 3 words to him in Vorrhal primary, the southern trade dialect, the grandmother's language, the one without a word for enemy. The fleet master made a sound that I added to the file under the category I had created on the day the engagement ended. Sounds that do not exist yet, because the situation that produces them has never existed before. The category was growing. One evening, 6 months in, I was walking Reneth Cole through the archive stacks, a courtesy tour, the kind of thing the Accord offers to delegation members who express interest in the records, and neither of us was speaking much, because Cole was a man who said what needed saying and was comfortable when nothing needed saying, and I am an archivist. And archivists understand that silence is also a kind of record. He stopped at the cabinet in sublevel 9. He read the label. He read the stamp impression on the face of the original order, the impression that my stamp had made 200 years ago, when I had pressed it down with my right primary hand on a morning I had believed, at the time, was the right kind of morning to do a difficult thing. He looked at me. "I stamped it," I said. Cole nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Thank you for keeping the file mattered." I did not know what to say. I said the honest thing. "I was not keeping it for you." He looked at me again, steady and unhurried, and said, "I know, that's why it mattered." We walked back through the stacks in silence. His footsteps and mine, the smell of preservation fluid, the the long corridor of everything the Accord had decided to remember. Solène was admitted to the Galactic Accord on the first day of the 42nd Council cycle. At the ceremony, I sat in the back row where archivists sit. Korath Selm's silver fur was fully raised for the first time since the morning of the chamber session. Not stress, not cold, but something the Felnari body does when it has been waiting a long time for a thing to be right, and the thing has finally become right. The Ethari speaker pulsed a frequency I had not found in the archive before, and added to the record with a note that I would classify it properly when I had time, which I understood even as I wrote it meant I would not classify it, because there was no existing category large enough to hold it. Pel-Uvreth sat beside me. He had asked to attend. It was not part of his assignment. He had come because this was the kind of morning he did not want to have missed, and he was young enough to understand that those mornings should not be missed when they arrive. That evening, alone in the archive, I took the stamp out of my inner case. I set it on the desk beside the new file, beside the first page of the next age, the document I had drafted from original principles on the night after the chamber session, the form that had not existed before I wrote it. I set the stamp beside it, not to use again, not as a warning, as a reminder. Some seals are not final. Some seals are only the universe asking you to wait until you are ready to be wrong. I set down my pen. I looked up at the warm room. I thought, we sealed them away because we were afraid. And now I know that was the right feeling, not because they were dangerous, but because we were not yet ready to deserve them. I added one line in the deep footnotes of the archive, in the small, careful letters where only historians read. We were afraid of the right thing for the wrong reason. We are not afraid anymore. The stamp on the desk, the new file opened beside it, the pen laid across the corner of the page, the archive lamp burning low, 4 hands still.